Hello there, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today I have a ships video for you where I present you the 3 pre-closed beta ships for the War Thunder naval section, namely the Russian PR-1124 MLRS, the German S-204 Lang, and also the American Alka 80 feet PT-109, which was famously commanded by John F. Kennedy, the later president of the United States of America. And also, Drachinifel has provided me with 5-minute guides to each and single one of those patrol boats. And the stories are hilarious, so you better listen to them. Before I release now the 5-minute guides on you with some gameplay in the background from me, and then later on a little rundown what I think about the ships, where there are their strengths and weaknesses, and then I guess the video will not be too long, hopefully. So first of all, again, the link to Drachinifel's awesome YouTube channel is in the video description down below. Gaijin actually sold those things 2 years ago, and then I couldn't play them up until, let's say, recently. And before that, Gaijin actually offered a refund because then later on the destroyer packs came in. I refused the offer of getting then a discount for the destroyer packs because I'm a collector. Sadly, I only bought the PR-1124 MLRS, and so I only got a test drive on the S-204 and also here on the Alka 80 feet PT-109. But at least I can play them. Later, some in the future, like when Gaijin has a premium anniversary sale, then they get sold again for overpriced prices, then I will get my hands on them. But for the moment, I think it's worth to have a look back how the ships stack up to their competition. You don't see them that often on the waves of War Thunder for one or the other reason. Some of the people actually took the offer, some of them are not bringing them out or are now no longer playing the CBT because they're the open beta actually at this point, because they're waiting for new content, they're waiting for changes, and there are desperately some changes needed, especially about aircraft. They are currently not the greatest fun if you are still on the ship. It's a ship open beta, not like planes dropping Fritz X and torpedoes at Ships Simulator 2018. Okay, now without further ado, let's go right into it and let's see how the ships do. And I hope you enjoyed Drachinifel's 5-minute guide.
Meanwhile, in Soviet Russia, you fight a land invasion using a ship, which is also a tank. Clearly this is the way to go. The PR-1124 was part of a wider Soviet effort to combat the German advance, with a series of armoured boats which were sometimes flat out called riverine tanks, although they would also occasionally see service in the Black and Baltic Seas against S-boats and other targets. Their primary role was in securing the many river and coastal areas for use by the Red Army. Although these were vulnerable to icing up, they were much more reliable as supply lines than the mud pits that were formerly known as roads, and so both sides sought to control them, or if they couldn't, at least deny them to the enemy. At around 75 to 80 feet long, several hundred Project 1124 and their smaller Project 1125 cousins would be built, displacing about 26 tons for a Project 1125 and 48 tons for a Project 1124, with their development starting before the war in the mid-1930s. They were not designed to operate against large shipping targets, and this meant no torpedoes were carried. But apart from a few heavy machine guns, their main armament consisted of tank turrets, 2 on the Project 1124 and 1 on the Project 1125. At first, these were taken from T-26, T-28 and T-35 tanks that had little other use, but as production ramped up, the 76mm gun in the T-34 turret became standard, with the anti-aircraft machine guns appearing in their own miniature turret. Again, sometimes the secondary turrets of older tanks were used, repurposed for riverine use. This came alongside a number of single machine guns positioned for close-in work. Later on, the T-34-85 turrets with the heavier 85mm gun would be used. Most of the tank turrets would obviously come with their own machine gun as well. Since they would face significant resistance from shore-based fire as well as other light shipping, these boats would carry armour against small fire and against some light cannons. with much of the weight of the Project 1124s being in thicker armour as well as the second turret, along with the turret itself obviously retaining its own protection. They had to be moved from river to river by train, and so their profile was carefully shaped so as to allow them to pass through rail tunnels and the like when they were being moved over land. They were not the fastest vessels, moving at around 21 knots maximum speed, but they were heavily engaged, with quite a number lost over the course of the war in the line of duty. A number of variants were also produced. One swapped the turrets for heavy anti-aircraft guns, another swapped the rear turret for the Katyushka rocket launchers for better shore bombardment. German gunboats on the various rivers had a nasty surprise when these boats first deployed to oppose them during the German advance, and they would also serve as mine layers and light troop transports when the need arose. This included raids behind enemy lines where groups of these vessels would take troops down the river into the German rear areas, where they would then launch attacks on supply depots and surprise German units, with useful fire support from what was effectively a couple of tank platoons and some optional rocket artillery, both to support the attack and to cover any retreat. This forced the Germans to deploy armoured units to counter the raiders. Thanks to the fact that whilst smaller than most ships, they were much bigger than most tanks, they proved irritatingly persistent to the Wehrmacht, as tank anti-armour piercing rounds would make a small hole, but on average would fail to hit anything especially vital, and did not impair their fighting capability in the same way that such a hit on a tank would. Their exceptionally shallow draft would allow them to operate in water where you could wade alongside them, if of course you had a death wish and fancied a dip in the freezing Russian winter. Necessity is the mother of invention, and over time the ship's shallow draft would disappear as the crews rigged extra features like ice-breaking plating on the bows, additional machine guns, spare anti-aircraft cannon, and extra rocket launchers, along with some heating units to keep warm. As well as specific missions, the general support role would often be quite varied, starting the day with running ammunition and supplies to troops across the river that they were on, then operating in direct fire support on either offensive or defensive operations, alternating with anti-aircraft fire against German ground support aircraft, and then taking the wounded back to safety as evening drew in. After the war, updated and newer designs of riverine craft would come into service, but a number of these boats would be preserved in various towns and cities as memorials to their crews and the war in general.
So there you have it, great Soviet engineering, comrade. How does the ship actually perform in War Thunder? Well, before we talk about the firepower, the armor, the rockets and the mobility, it actually comes down to one final thing, and that is the ultimate reason why this ship is not so good. You might see it or might not see it currently in the gameplay. The ship can't aim at an enemy ship if there are just the slightest hints of waves. So the sea must be extremely calm, and that is down to RNG. You first have to check if there are any waves. Anything bigger than the stuff that you currently see in the gameplay, and you cannot aim at enemy ships. Maybe at close quarters, maybe with shotgunning the enemy with the rockets, but then again, they are not that easy to hit. You only have 16 of them, so the actual what you see in the X-ray is actually not reloadable, which is kind of a shame. The T-34 turret is actually pretty nice at medium to slightly long range, but there are so many more ships that do the job better than you. So you don't have a fully stabilized system. Your secondaries are not so strong as on the other Russian armored river patrol boats. So it's in this respect a bit disappointing. But there are the moments, like the upcoming scenes, where you think that this ship is really strong. But trust me when I say this, it was rather the exception. The ship is fragile, the armor doesn't really protect you against proper cannons such as 37mm and also 40mm in particular. They just rip you apart. You cannot really expect to bow tank, because the armor piercing shots even from 20mm will go through your bow and actually ignite the armor. The rate of fire on the 76mm gun is not the highest. While it can do damage and while your favorite target are enemy bigger ships, at some point, especially against the larger enemies, you kind of find it difficult to actually make a difference. Again, only if you ambush the enemy and if you shotgun them with rockets. Despite having 4 kilos of TNT equivalent filling, or nearly 4 kilos, the damage output at times is very, very sad indeed, and you ask yourself if you should have aimed better or if it was actually worth purchasing this ship. It's situational. You require the right map, you require calm seas, you require team play, and you need the enemy to come at you from the right angle, basically feeding themselves for you. And this is not a ship that is really by definition good. There are moments where it's great, and this was probably the greatest moment ever. First hit, second hit, and so it goes, because he just doesn't really aim at me. Now let's aim for the bow. And do we hit him? There we go. Perfect kill, right? Yeah, but he was not really damaging me. He was not really at close range. He was not using its maneuverability to outmaneuver me. There is no torpedo aimed at me. The enemies come at me one at a time. Now, there are Soviet ships, Soviet river patrol boats that have more armor, significantly more armor, that are larger, have more secondaries, have 285mm guns that are stabilized, and they are complete and utter monsters, and I don't want to go into a 1 versus 1 against them at any sort of range, and so I try to avoid them. But this one, that is so situational, I think I don't care if I face it, I try my best. If you get a full broadside at close range from the rockets, of course, they can ignite your ammunition racks and then it's over. So here you can see I'm going here into A, and I have a pretty lucky run. So let's just see what we can do, and we rack up the kills here and getting good damaging volleys into the enemy. So I focus here on the larger ships, on the ones that actually fire at me first, and I try to hit their undamaged sections. Against the tier 1 ships, you actually can blacken one section with one hit. There I took out the R130, which is a dangerous ship. Now I actually switch here to this one while dodging the torpedoes. And yeah, you can see you are the hard hitter. But if he chooses to fire at me with the 40mm or with his 76mm with armor piercing, there is not much that I can do, and so ultimately we trade. That was my best run. Now let's move on to the S-204.
The German force of smaller, fast torpedo craft were known as Schnellboot to their owners, a term that literally means fast boats. So in English they should be called S-boats. But at the time the forces facing them, the British motor torpedo boats, motor gunboats, frigates and destroyers, simply called them enemy boats, or E-boats. These terms therefore can all be used interchangeably, although it can be confusing to keep track of. For the purposes of this guide, we will call them S-boats. The idea of a small, fast, torpedo-armed motorboat was not new. The Imperial German Navy had experimented with the idea, but in the aftermath of World War I, the need for them became more apparent, since with the loss of all modern capital ships, they offered one of the few routes the Reichsmarine, later to become the Kriegsmarine, had actually got to inflict significant damage on larger enemy vessels. The shipbuilding company Lürsen, based in Bremen, had come up with a good design that was adopted and served as the basis of all future E-boats, leading to a great deal of superficial similarity across the various subtypes. Due to a phenomenon known as the Lürsen effect using angled rudders, the boats were capable of unusually high speed. The overall design would rapidly grow in size from just over 50 tons to just over 100 tons displacement on the standard model and over 120 tons on the largest. Visually, the boats would lose some early portholes, and when the bridge received armour, this lowered the profile somewhat. This is actually reflected in the medal awarded to S-boat crews after 3 successful operations, which was redesigned mid-war to more accurately reflect the appearance of their craft. They were normally armed with a pair of torpedo tubes built into the hull facing forward, often with a pair of reloads carried on deck. This was their primary anti-shipping armament, but would later include acoustic homing torpedoes, and was supplemented for self-defense and anti-aircraft roles at first by either an MG-38 or MG-42 on the bow, and a single 20mm cannon amidships near the bridge, although with some loose machine guns lying around for use where needed. This would evolve over time to a 20mm replacing the bow machine guns, a twin 20mm replacing the single amidships, and a heavier installation on the stern, most commonly a 37mm flak cannon, but some boats would carry a captured 40mm Bofors or a quad 20mm flak Veerling instead. Additional single and twin 20mm were also installed depending on the boat in question, so that some craft ended up wielding no less than 10 20mm cannon. However, the heavier stern mount was generally preferred, as the crews felt that the 20mm did not have much stopping power against enemy attack craft, although it was very handy against attacking aircraft. They would also often carry mines, both on rails and for launch from their torpedo tubes, and a number of ships would be sunk by these means. This defensive battery, along with their high speed, were vital since, outside of the later armoured superstructures, the boats were built as light as possible for speed, and so were somewhat vulnerable to incoming fire. Many late war photos showing the craft with numerous small patches where armour-piercing rounds had poked holes in them. They proved fairly effective in operations in the North, Baltic, Black and Mediterranean seas, their size and light construction meaning they were much less useful further north in heavy and icy waters. In terms of enemy tonnage sunk versus their own tonnage lost, they would prove the second most effective arm of the Kriegsmarine after the U-boats. Their high speed and greater size and armament initially gave them a significant advantage over the Royal Navy's motor torpedo boats and other similar light escorts, but as the war progressed, newer and more heavily armed motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats and a proliferation of frigates would mean that the S-boats were on the losing side of more and more skirmishes as time went on. Of note is that these fights saw some of the last boarding actions conducted in war, with both sides boarding and capturing a number of craft from the other in short-range gunfights and occasional hand-to-hand melee combat. S-204 was one of the largest S-boats produced, part of the S-139 subclass, launched in 1944 with an armoured bridge and a displacement of 121 tons, operating with the 4th Flotilla under Captain Lieutenant Fiman in the North Sea and English Channel. One of its distinguishing features being the Black Panther emblem of the 4th Flotilla. This boat would survive its relatively short war career and would surrender, along with S-205, to 10 British motor torpedo boats and was then escorted to HMS Beehive, a Royal Navy base in Felixstowe in Suffolk, and would later be transferred to the Soviet Navy and commissioned as TK-1020.
In War Thunder, the S-204 has a tech tree equivalent, which is the S-100 from 1945. Now, you have two 20mm mountings, and whereas they have great bursting damage and actually have a fairly high rate of fire and have a good ammunition ratio between armor piercing and high explosive, very often the size of the magazines is not big enough to fully gun down the enemy. You have no armor whatsoever, you're a big target, and despite having two torpedoes, they are not your main weapon. However, once you are out and forced to reload the 20mm, you always can switch to the 37mm. And despite being fed with a 5-round clip or 5-round magazine, it has barely any existing reloads and therefore can continue fire up until the end of times, or when you are out of ammunition after 1,000 rounds. The 37mm hit harder, it has a higher range and also has a very good ammunition belt. As you can see, it has also a very good firing angle, whereas the firing angles or the overlaps of the 20mm is fairly restricted. In this respect, you have to choose if you use the 20mm or the 37mm. One then might argue that you can just simply reverse into the enemy with the 37mm blazing. However, the gun shield, once being hit even by 20mm or 50 caliber armor piercing shells, actually gets registered as being disabled and you have to repair, which is kind of annoying and denies you this option as a reliable way of dealing with your enemy. So you have to maneuver. First you get in with the 20mm, try to burst the enemy down or inflict as much damage as possible, and then just simply switch to the 37mm. In this respect, I think the S100 from 1944 with the 30mm and the Whirlwind quadruple 20mm mounting in the back is better suited for the meta of War Thunder and inflicts more damage and is just more or is better to play. So I think if you have now the tech tree counterpart, the S100 from 1945, you're not missing out in any way, shape or form in performance, unlike with the Alco 80 feet PT-109 that was famously commanded by John F. Kennedy, which we will talk about now.
The American equivalent of the S-boats, MTBs, MGBs, MAS boats, etc., were the PT boats, or patrol torpedo boats. As might be imagined, they have relatively little use around the United States, as with their small size and relatively short range, there wasn't exactly anyone for them to defend against or attack in the area. But when transported overseas to operational theatres, they would be able to see action in and around the various island chains and coastal areas that characterized parts of the Pacific element of World War II against Japan. They came in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, from 70 foot to 81 foot in length, and manufactured by a number of different companies in a number of different ways. However, the Elco 80-foot boat would be the one with the biggest production run, and serves as a good general guide to their characteristics and operational uses. At 56 tons, with a 41-knot top speed, they were somewhat lighter than S-boats and a fraction slower, but generally faster than British motor torpedo boats and motor gunboats. Like S-boats, they were primarily designed for attacking larger targets, and to this end carried 4 single torpedo launchers without reloads, giving them a larger single salvo than most S-boats, but obviously no ability to reload this. Gun armament, as standard, consisted of a twin 50 caliber machine gun mount and a 20mm Oryx. But of course the American habit of bolting a gun to every available surface was not limited to larger ships, and additional 30 and 50 caliber machine guns, more 20mm Oryx, mortars, rocket launchers, and heavier 37mm and 40mm salvaged aircraft and anti-tank cannons were not unusual sights on PT boats as the war progressed. Smoke generators were also fitted to give a degree of concealment when they were under attack. Some boats would also carry mines or depth charges, although these were more for discouraging chases by larger ships than for anti-submarine work. Life as a PT boat crewman could be fast and exciting, but in some cases also very short, as whilst the Sherman tank had a somewhat undeserved reputation for catching fire, the gasoline-powered and lightly built PT boats had a very well-deserved reputation for exploding in an almost absurd Michael Bay-style fireball if they took a direct hit from Japanese guns. The boats would primarily operate at night and had to learn how to be very quiet and stealthy, since the Pacific theatre had the added issue of much phosphorescent marine life that glowed when agitated, which made travelling at high speed hazardous, since this tended to lead to a giant glowing arrow pointing right at your position. Whilst the PD boat crews pursued their targets with vigour, they were hampered by the lack of radar at first, and also the Mark 8 torpedo which they were issued with. The Bureau of Ordnance had outdone themselves with this one, since as bad as the Mark 14 was, it generally launched and ran straight, even if its main function in the early part of the war was to occasionally bash dents in an enemy's hull. The Mark 8, on the other hand, was known for all sorts of interesting features, including, but not limited to, not launching when activated, sometimes needing judicious application of hammers to get them underway, partially clearing the tube and starting up the motors, leading to eventual explosive disintegration of the motors whilst they were still on the boat, setting fire to their launchers on the way out, thanks to the tubes being heavily grease-lined and fired by black powder, launching or part launching completely at random, knocking men and or equipment overboard, and assuming that they actually got in the water, often wandering off on their own chosen path and then not detonating reliably, assuming that they actually hit something. Fortunately, after a couple of years of this, the torpedo and its system were generally replaced with new non-gunpowder using launchers and the Mark 13 torpedo, which, somewhat ironically considering its numbering, happened to work perfectly fine. PT-109 was one of the PT-103 class and started life as a standard 80-foot Elco boat, eventually coming under the command of Junior Grade Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, future President of the United States. At the time of her most famous mission, she was sporting the standard armament, plus a single-shot 37mm anti-tank gun that they'd found somewhere, and bolted to the front of the boat. Their mission was as part of a large gathering of PT boats assembled to intercept Japanese destroyers that, thanks to American code breaking, were known to be due through the area. But between the lack of radar and faulty Mark 8s, 24 torpedoes resulted in a grand total of nothing. PT-109 then had to shield its division leader from detection after its torpedo tubes caught fire after launching. Leaving the area under smoke, most of the other destroyers were missed, but not the Amagiri, which had completed the supply run the PT boats were supposed to stop, and was returning. It came out of nowhere, and within 10 seconds had run down the PT boat, which the ship itself had spotted and deliberately aimed for. A comically large 100-foot-high fireball from the explosion of the boat on impact resulted. What followed was a series of incidents that really need their own video to fully explain, but included friendly locals, messages carved into coconuts, a miniature muscle-powered island-hopping campaign, an Australian camping out on a mountain surrounded by unsuspecting Japanese soldiers, and a tremendous amount of personal bravery that ended up returning the surviving crew to friendly hands, with the rescue itself handled by another PT boat.
Again, in War Thunder, the Elco 80 feet PT-109 is a very interesting ship, and at first I have to say that it doesn't look in any way, shape or form spectacular. It doesn't have a 40mm Bofors, it doesn't have a Wirbelwind in the back, it doesn't have some crazy armament, and it only relies mostly on 50 cals. But as you could see in the background so far, that can rack up insane amount of kills, and yeah, I want to talk you through this. First of all, the best way that you use this ship is again in an ambush position. The ship has very low survivability. Once you come under fire, once you come under enemy under stress, you go down fairly quickly. You lose a lot of crew. You're very vulnerable to high explosive, to 20, 37, 40mm, 25mm gunfire, rockets, bombs, aircraft. They all can actually hurt you, but you can hurt them back. And I think in this respect the 50 cals are really great. You are not forced to have such a quick time in your reload, so this is an advantage compared to the German 20mm, and you can even slightly outrange them. You have equal to even more penetration power. You do a lot of damage, but you have to aim to the right side, because there you can actually bring all 450 cals or all 2 double mountings to bear, and keep the 20mm as a last ditch resort or as a reserve, because the amount of ammunition is very low on the 20mm. However, use it against enemy aircraft, so toggle your gunner to only fire at enemy aircraft, and that then will bring you the most out of the ship. Always be in an ambush position, never pick a direct fight. Once you get under fire, try to get the hell out of there. Now let's talk about the torpedoes. You have 4 of them, they have a decent range, they have a decent speed underwater, and so you actually can make the famous torpedo pattern, as I want to demonstrate here. Now I have killed a fair amount of enemy ships, and if you use all your assets, all your torpedoes, your smokes, your artillery strikes, keep the 20mm in reserve, and just fight around capture zones, but don't go into capture zones, you can get insane results, you can stay alive, you can have a great impact on the game, you can be a very good benefit for your team. You're fairly fast, so go into cover of an island and just pre-aim your guns, your machine guns, into a section where you can expect enemies to come. And look at this, we have our first customer and they're ramming each other. That's perfect teamwork, at least from my perspective. That gets me actually the double strike, the first strike, and actually a triple strike. So this is how the enemy teamwork themselves to death. Thank you very much. That is doing good footage. Again, if you aim to the right, you bring all 450 cals to bear. You have 800 rounds for all 4 of them before you have to go through the reload. That reload is then much longer than on the German 20mm because, you know, belt fed, so you have to pay for the extra amount of fire time with longer reload. For that, either you go into cover, you wait for the reload, or you actually go to your 20mm. The problem with the 20mm is that while it has a 60 round magazine, so more than the German one, it has a very limited amount of overall ammunition, which is a drawback, and that is rather precious, especially in late game scenarios when you are actually in a problematic situation, when you get threatened to run out of 50 caliber ammunition and there is no cap nearby available to restock your ammunition amount, and also there are aircraft flying around. And in the anti-aircraft role at this low battle rating, where you actually mostly face more fragile opponents, the single 20mm can pose a significant threat against aircraft, and my autogunners have shot down a fair amount of them. So here you can see the 50 caliber performance, great muzzle velocity, high shell density in the air, flat trajectory. You can actually aim very well at fast enemies, but despite all the good firing qualities, don't go into a fair fight. Always stick with your team, always suppress the enemy by having the numerical advantage, and if you play smart, you always can have the enemy in your most efficient gun sight. Always aim over the right. To the left you cannot bring all 4 machine guns to bear. Now the ship that we see here in War Thunder is actually missing the 37mm front gun, and to be honest, I think this is for the better, because if it would have this gun as well, I think it would pay for it with a higher battle rating, and then many of those advantages would not really stick out that much. So I think at 2.0 this ship is fast, it's fun, it's efficient, it's deadly, it teaches you how to PT boat basically, and I love to share this experience with you. Now let's talk here about the gameplay. You can see that the enemy's activity around A has literally died down, and so I actually went back into my side of the map, and I transitioned over to C, now having the goal to support the fight at B. I saw the enemy patrol boat shooting here the torpedoes in a kind of panic mode. He was about to die. Now there is the S-100. I begin to fire even before he is coming around the island. That gives him little to no reaction time, and that's my 6th kill, just like this. You saw the previous game in a very similar situation where I racked up 12 kills, so that is quite impressive. Also, I think that the 50 caliber together with the 20mm versus aircraft are very efficient. The gun traverse, or the gun mounting traverse, is fairly fast. The elevation speed, the elevation angles, they're really great. So despite the ship not promising you that much according to the stat card, in battle it performs really well as long as you don't get shot. But I think the overwhelming majority of PT boats give you that impression. One final thing is again that we have to think about actually at some point getting into a capture point to get back the clips for the 20mm or the magazines. The same goes for the 50 cals. It is also worth reloading the torpedoes because you have 4 of them, and that can actually keep you in the battle for much longer, especially when the opposition weakens down because people are running out of their ship spawns, and if they only bring weaker ships into the battle, then you really have the pure dominance, and then it would be a shame if you actually would run out of ammunition, because the rate of fire is high. You have plenty of 50 caliber machine guns, so it's not unlikely to actually run out of ammunition in mid battle if you're not careful. Now if you look at the battle right now, I was not overly aggressive. I was a bit lucky. I was staying with the team. I was not going on a solo trip, and I was expecting the enemy's action. I was using the island cover. I was always positioning myself so I could fire over the right of the ship, and I think that brought in the results. Now let's see what we can do to this G5. The autogunners brought down another aircraft. Can we defeat here this G5? Well, he goes down to 60%, but just only moments later I actually got the kill because it seems like he bailed out. Now that actually brings us now to the end of the battle, and I think it was really great. I had a lot of fun playing all three of them, with the exception actually of the PR1124 MLRS, but then again, if there were calm waters like in the video footage that I showed you, then it was amazing. So that's the end of this battle and the overall presentation. Let me know in the comment section how you actually enjoyed this triple presentation. Making one video about 3 ships is very efficient. It's a good look back into the past, what could have been, and yeah, for 8 kills and 2 aircraft, we got quite a lot of Silver Lines and RP, despite not having the premium bonus because it's a test drive. Again, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Please give this video a like if it did, subscribe if you want to see more. Then also check out Drachinifel's YouTube channel, link in the video description down below, and we'll see each other on the waves of War Thunder.